Back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there were secularists, atheists primarily, some deists, who rejected the Bible and rejected the flood of Noah's day, who said, how do we explain all the fossil layers that are laid down over the earth with all these dead things in them? Well, they weren't there to see those fossil layers form, but they said, oh, they had to be laid down slowly over millions of years. By the way, that's where the idea of millions of years came from in our modern world. It came primarily out of atheism, out of people who believe in naturalism, that everything happens by natural processes. There's no supernatural involved. Now, what happened in history, in church history, there was a man, a great man of God actually, called Thomas Chalmers, the founder of the Free Church of Scotland, who said, well, we can take the millions of years and fit in a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. And that's really the origin of what's called the gap theory or the ruin reconstruction theory. It's really a way of trying to fit man's belief about millions of years into the Bible. And most people in our churches have heard of the gap theory. It got into the Schofield Reference Bible, in the notes, of course, it's not in the text. And a lot of people believe this idea that, it sort of developed over time too. But the classic gap theory is that God created everything, but then Lucifer rebelled. And as a result of that rebellion, God judged with a flood called Lucifer's flood, and that's where your fossils supposedly fit. And then God recreated everything in 6 days. But there's some major, major problems with that. First of all, you're trying to fit millions of years into the Bible. Secondly, why would you have a flood the Bible doesn't talk about, explaining the fossils, instead of the one it does talk about, and that is the flood of Noah's day? I believe most of the fossil record is a result of Noah's flood. Now, here's an interesting situation. The reason the gap theory was invented in the first place was to try to accommodate the millions of years proposed by people who said the fossil record was laid down slowly over millions of years. That's where the millions of years came from. But then with the people who promoted the gap theory used a flood, a catastrophe called Lucifer's flood, to try to explain the fossil record to account for the millions of years, but the millions of years came from the idea the fossils were laid down slowly. So they just did away with the reason they wanted the millions of years in the first place. Because if the millions of years came from slow deposition over millions of years to form the fossil record, you can't take that and explain it away with a catastrophe and say that's how we fit the millions of years in. It doesn't make any sense. So there's no way you can fit a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 anyway, because of the way the Hebrew is written. When we read the phrase, and the earth, it's the verb with the noun, earth, as a verb disjunctive, that means it's really a comment verse on verse 1. In other words, verse 2 is really, the earth that God made, it was without form and void. In other words, didn't really have anything in regard to form to it, because it was just a watery, mattery blob, if you like. It was just covered with water. God didn't make the dry land appear until day 3, that then really gave it form. So verse 2 is sort of a description of the earth in verse 1. So really reading it through from perspective of historical narrative, typical Jewish historical narrative, it's in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, darkness was upon the face of the deep. That's just a comment on verse 1, and God said. So it really goes from verse 1 to verse 3, and God said. And if you believe in the gap theory, you've also got death before sin. The Bible makes it very clear, by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, and that man was Adam, the first man, Adam, who was made on day 6. So you can't have all this death in the fossil record before sin. There's so many other problems with the gap theory as well. Again, the gap theory was a way devised to try to accommodate millions of years into the Bible, and we need to give up the gap theory. And just one verse here to finish off with. There are many other inconsistencies I could point out in regard to the gap theory, but read Exodus 20, verse 11. Now, it's a basis of the fourth commandment. In 6 days, God made the heavens and the earth, which is Genesis 1:1, and the sea and all that in them is, which is the rest of Genesis 1, in 6 days, in 6 consecutive days. There's no room for a gap. In other words, in those 6 days, God made everything in 6 literal days. Because Exodus 20 verse 11 is the basis of the 4th commandment, talking about God made everything in 6 days and rested for 1. It's actually the basis of our 7-day week. That's where the 7-day week comes from.